Hey, Chivis! I'm Aiwe, and today we are talking about the Basques, a language with no relatives, and the myth of Atlantis. If you enjoy stories like this, hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Let's go. A thin bronze palm, no bigger than a child's hand, is being lifted from a bed of ash. The ash is 2,000 years old. The hand is older still, in the way that meaning is older than metal, because scratched into its surface, in letters no wider than a fingernail, is a single word. Any Basque speaker alive today can read it on sight. Act 1. A door in the mountains. In the summer of 2022, archaeologists working at a site called Irulegi in the Arangren Valley of northern Spain were excavating a settlement burned during the Sartorian Wars, the long Roman struggle to absorb the Iberian Peninsula in the 2nd century before the Common Era. The fire had collapsed the house and sealed its contents in a layer of dust and charcoal. Most of what they found was small, broken, ordinary. Then someone noticed a piece of flat bronze the size of a hand, with a hole punched at the wrist, lying where it had apparently fallen on the threshold. The piece looked at first like a helmet fitting. It was months before the inscription was even visible. When conservators cleaned bronze, 5 words surfaced, scratched in the semi-syllabary also used across northeastern Iberia. The first word on the hand, sorioneku, almost certainly meant good fortune or of good omen. The modern Basque word is sorioneku. In 2,000 years, only 2 letters have changed. That should not be possible. Languages drift. Greek changed. Latin bled into a dozen daughters. An English speaker would struggle to read English from 2 centuries back, let alone understand a 1,000-year-old text. And yet, here is a Bronze Age Iberian word, lifted from a burned doorway, still legible in the mouths of the people who live in the same valleys today. Linguists had long argued that the Basques were illiterate, that their language had never been written at home. The Hand of Irulegi overturned that quietly. It is the oldest sentence in Basque ever recovered, and a third of its words are still being debated. But the first word, the one that begins a line, anyone can read. Act 2. A language without parents. Euskara, the Basque language, is one of the great oddities of European linguistics. It has no demonstrated genetic relationship to any other living language. Indo-European tongues stretch from Irish to Russian, from Portuguese to Bengali, and they all share deep common roots. Euskara sits outside that tree entirely. Linguists have spent careers trying to connect it to Berber, to Caucasian languages, to Sino-Tibetan, to ancient Iberian, to the language of the Aquitanians recorded in Roman inscriptions. None of these proposals has been accepted as proven. Some remain unfalsifiable rather than disproven, and that distinction matters. The Aquitanian connection is the strongest candidate on the table. Roman-era inscriptions across the Western Pyrenees record personal and place names that look strikingly Basque, suggesting that Euskara has been spoken in this corner of Europe for at least 2,000 years in a form we can recognize. The language also contains some Latin loanwords, but those are recent additions, picked up over centuries of contact, not evidence of family ties. What makes the language remarkable is less its absolute isolation and more its persistence. Rome tried to absorb the Basques. The Visigoths tried. The Moors tried. In 1937, Francisco Franco's regime banned public use of Euskara entirely. The language survived anyway, not through books or broadcasts, but through kitchen tables. Parents taught children. Children taught grandchildren. For 4 decades of dictatorship, the language was illegal, in schools, in print, in public, and yet it endured. Roughly 750,000 people still speak it today, a small but living number. Act 3. The blood. The Basques are not only linguistically distinct, they are also, by European standards, genetically unusual. The most cited and best replicated finding is the high frequency of Rh-negative blood, specifically the absence of the rhesus D antigen on red blood cells. The trait is named after the rhesus macaque in which the antigen was first identified in 1940 by Karl Landsteiner and Alexander Wehner, but the gene has been doing its work in humans for far longer than that. Most humans are Rh positive, around 93% globally, and about 15 to 17% in most of Europe. The Basque rate is markedly higher. Earlier estimates put it at 1 in 3, around 33%, though more recent surveys suggest closer to 25%. Either way, the figure is roughly double the rest of Europe and several times the global average. The trait is recessive, so it hides in carriers. But for it to stay this concentrated, a population has to marry inside itself for an extremely long time. There is a hard biological cost that comes with the trait. When an Rh negative mother carries an Rh positive fetus, her immune system can mistake the baby's red blood cells for something foreign. The first pregnancy is often unaffected. Later, Rh positive pregnancies can trigger a response that attacks the fetal blood, a condition now called hemolytic disease of the fetus and newborn. Without modern treatment, those children were at high risk of dying before or shortly after birth. For a recessive trait that kills children, you would expect it to thin out over generations. In the Basque, it did not. A 2015 study in Nature Communications, led by Torsten Günther and colleagues, looked at ancient DNA from across Europe and found that Basques show closer genetic continuity with early European farmers than their neighbors, with less later admixture from incoming populations, including the steppe-derived groups that swept into Europe during the Bronze Age. That pattern is consistent with long-term isolation. It does not require any lost island to explain. Act 4. The Drowned Coast. To understand why the Basque might have stayed apart, you have to look at the ground beneath the Bay of Biscay. About 20,000 years ago, at the peak of the last ice age, so much water was locked in continental ice sheets that global sea level sat roughly 120 meters, about 400 feet, lower than today. The continental shelf beneath the bay was dry land. Rivers cut valleys across it. Forests grew where fish now swim. People could walk from what is now the Spanish coast far out past the current shoreline. Then the ice began to melt. Over thousands of years, the seas rose in pulses. At the biggest surges, the ocean climbed as much as 50 feet within a few human lifetimes. People watched the land their parents had known disappear. Forests drowned, valleys filled, hills became islands, and the islands went under. Sonar mapping of the bay floor has confirmed the existence of these submerged river valleys in detail. The drowned landscape is real. The hypothesis is straightforward. As the coast vanished, the people who lived on it had to move. The Pyrenees, the only high ground in the region, was the natural destination. The populations that withdrew into those mountains and stayed there would have had less reason to mix with later arrivals. The geographic argument is a clean one, and it does not require Atlantis. The folk memory argument is messier. Some Basque fishing traditions are said to include names for specific underwater valleys, the Drowned Valley, the Lost Land, passed down for thousands of years, far longer than any written record could account for. The existence of the seafloor features is well documented. The specific naming tradition, kept alive for millennia, without writing, without maps, without the ability to descend 400 feet, is a strong claim and one for which the scholarly documentation is thin. It is at least as plausible that the names were assigned more recently by fishing communities reading the landscape in light of an older folk memory framework that was already in place. Honest treatment means holding both possibilities open. Act 5. Plato's story. The Atlantic connection does not come from Basque fishermen. It comes from a Greek philosopher. Around 360 before the Common Era, Plato wrote two dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, in which he set down a story he did not claim to invent. The story, he said, had been told a few generations earlier by the Athenian lawgiver Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests at the Temple of Sais. Those priests supposedly kept records going back thousands of years further than the Greeks, and in those records was an island empire in the Atlantic, beyond what the Greeks called the Pillars of Hercules, what we call the Strait of Gibraltar. They dated the destruction of that empire to roughly 9,000 years before Solon, which would place the event at about 9600 before the Common Era, an extraordinary claim for the time. Plato described Atlantis in vivid detail. Mountains ringed the island. The capital was built in concentric rings of land and water. The navy was supposed to have included 1,200 warships. The temples and wealthy homes were sheathed in a mysterious reddish metal called orichalcum, second only to gold in value. The orichalcum detail is interesting because in Greek the word seems to mean mountain copper, and the Basques were, in their own time, famous copper workers. The parallel is suggestive, but the parallel is not the connection. No physical orichalcum of Atlantean origin has ever been identified. Most scholars read Plato's Atlantis as a thought experiment, a moral warning about hubris dressed in geographic fiction. Some have argued, less convincingly, that it preserves a memory of a real event such as a Terra eruption or a Minoan collapse. Either way, the work is a literary artifact, not a historical record. Act 6. Memory and Speculation. The Basque folk tradition called Atlantica is harder to place. The term does not appear in traditional Basque literature in any form that scholars can verify before the modern era. The Basque cultural memory of a drowned coast is genuine and well documented. The specific word Atlantica, the framing of an ancestral island, looks more like a 19th and 20th century borrowing, absorbed when European audiences fell in love with Atlantis after Ignatius Donnelly's 1882 book, Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, became a sensation. That does not make the tradition worthless. It means the form the tradition takes today has been shaped by the same popular imagination that shaped it everywhere else. The synthesis that this evidence actually supports is more interesting than the legend. The Basques are, by every measurable standard, one of the most distinctive populations in Europe. They have a real language isolate, a real genetic signature of long isolation, a real archaeological find that links Bronze Age speech to modern Basque, and they live in the very mountains that would have received the populations pushed off a real drowned coastline. Each of these facts is independently established. None of them requires Atlantis, and none of them, taken together, demonstrates any lost island civilization. What the legend does show is something honest about how human beings make sense of real isolation. A population that genuinely stood apart for thousands of years would naturally generate origin stories. Some of those stories would be about the sea, some would be about gods. The Basque story of Atlantica is one of those stories. It is worth taking seriously as a piece of cultural memory and worth not mistaking for a historical record. The door in the mountains, the bronze hand, the blood type that should have thinned and did not, the words that should have changed and did not. These are the real mysteries. They do not need an island to make them extraordinary. They are extraordinary already. If you found this worth your time, consider subscribing for more long-form investigations like this one. The sources and recommended reading are pinned in the comments. Until next time, thanks for listening.